Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm Dan Carney. Today I have for you an interview with Terra Ziporyn and Amy Wolfson, authors of the great new book, Educating the Exhausted, Adolescent Sleep and the Struggle for Later School Start. It's a brilliant combination of history, personal experience, and research, and I call it an inconvenient truth because I think you'd be hard pressed to find educational leaders who would disagree with their premise. But as Amy and Tara point out in the book, the issue is political will. And they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. They have an organization dedicated to building grassroots political will, to pushing later school start times. And they've had some success here in California. They helped get a law passed. And this book is a call to education leaders to take this seriously and try to build that political will. And I hope you enjoy this interview. And if you are yourself a school leader thinking about how early start times impact adolescence, this book is for you. I really enjoyed the book, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join me. I've been in education for about 16 years and teaching adolescents and noticing that sleep is a big deal. And one thing I like about the book is that you couch sleep as not just something on the checklist of wellness, but actually something foundational to how we live and function and thrive as humans. I would definitely call your book something like an inconvenient truth, I think is how I maybe would file it.
Yeah.
It's sort of a part history, part memoir, part policy analysis. I think that's fair to say. It reads really well.
100%.
And and I
100%.
wonder maybe if Tara, we could just start with something really foundational here.
Sure.
What is it about adolescent development that makes sleep so vital?
Sleep is really important, obviously, to every human being at every stage of life, right? It's absolutely foundational to growth, development, and basically every aspect of human function. But we pay attention to it at certain stages. It's particularly, we all pay attention to infant sleep. Everybody's very well aware that that matters. But there's something about adolescence that somehow it has fallen off the cliff of awareness. We sort of dismiss adolescence as this time of um, first of all, we don't really like adolescents as a society. We think of them as kind of, you know, ugly, smelly adults who can't quite get their act together. They should be able to take care of things. And so the topic of their well-being and their sleep often gets overlooked. But I think Amy can talk to you about the sleep research that shows that actually adolescents need as much, if not more, sleep than their younger counterparts. They also have a different need for it at different times of day, and it plays a particularly strong role in their health, safety, and performance, probably arguably more important, say, than younger kids, partly because we adults have less control over their sleep. And there are consequences involved in that. And so it is lost in the discussion, but it is as, if not more important than, say, infant sleep. And I think it would make sense to talk to Amy about why that is, from a research perspective.
Yeah. Well, let me just add, because I would say the other really important piece here, and it's funny, I hadn't really thought about this before. I thought we'd gotten past, from a psychology standpoint, the idea of adolescence being difficult and challenging was kind of thrown out decades ago. And there was a rethinking about adolescence being this really important stage of development, and we should be supportive and think optimistically and positively. And yet, I think in the midst of that, and we don't necessarily talk about this in the book, sleep got ignored, was not part of that conversation. And so sleep and adolescents end up being blamed for, and it being viewed as an individual issue that adolescents need to resolve themselves. And I think that speaks to one of your other questions, I believe. The other really important point from a research perspective is that developmental psychologists and educators will say this. Anyone who teaches middle school and high school will say, and we know this both from research and experientially, the fundamental stage in development for sort of growth and potential down the line is early adolescence. It's fundamental. Kind of succeeding in middle school, we know, has long-term implications that are much more important to think about than even early development. I mean, I don't want to knock, as Terra, I mean, we don't want to knock early development. It's also important. So it's all important. The point is adding this back in. And so when we think of sleep, the thing that's really fascinating too is, although we haven't proven this yet, the changes that occur both in terms of sleep need, or what we call sleep pressure, developing slower, meaning as an adolescent goes through the day, they build up this need, this sense of needing to sleep. We call it process S, more slowly than their younger siblings and peers, and more slowly than people who are a little bit older than they are, as well as the clock is delayed. So biologically, literally, the suprachiasmatic nucleus that's in the brain literally shifts to a later time, meaning you're not going to fall asleep until later in the evening, and as a result, you're going to wake up later in the morning. But all of that, it looks like, begins early in adolescence, or we know begins early in adolescence, and some researchers are wondering, is it even a marker for physiological adolescence? Meaning, is it might we see it as that crucial?
Yeah. And generally, Amy, what's the age range we're talking about here? The crucial age range when sleep is so vital?
Well, I would say from early adolescence until the end of high school. So we tend to, what we define as adolescence. So
Yeah.
American Academy of Pediatrics and American Psychological Association don't use the exact same range, but generally we're talking about age 10 to age 18. American Academy of Pediatrics will say until age 21, in fact. So it depends on but that's the time frame we're talking about. And you do start to see what we call a circadian advance, meaning the clock moves a little bit in the other direction. Varies individually, and there hasn't been a good longitudinal study to show this, but probably around age 20, 21, at least from cross-sectional data we know.
Okay. And Terra, as a society, how long have we known this? How long have we understood this about adolescence and sleep?
That's one of the really fascinating realities that finally hit us in looking into this topic, and it explains a lot of the problem. In fact, we haven't known this very
a lot
long.
of our work together on this as well.
There's a real disconnect. We have a whole chapter in our book about the history of this, which is one of the most interesting things for me to dig into this, because nobody really has before. It's really ironic that the very years that schools started moving to such early start times, because we really haven't always run our schools this way. That's another myth. But the very same years that the schools started moving early were just the beginnings. I'm talking about we didn't understand a lot of these things that Amy was talking about sleep, not even adolescent sleep, until the 1970s, when it really picked up. I mean, there was a little bit of work. Yeah. But the adolescent sleep stuff started in the 80s and picked up in the 90s. And you can almost, there's like an inverse correlation between the times high schools started and what we knew about how this was hurting kids. But these were different worlds. And this is one of the problems. One of the things I like about these types of discussions is that we need to have the educators hear from the scientists and vice versa, because they weren't talking to each other. The sleep researchers knew this, but the education policymakers were on a different planet. And it's not like they did it cruelly, like we're going to torture adolescents and deprive them of sleep. They just didn't know that it mattered what time schools started. So you sort of saw this in all of our society where, when I grew up, people talked about 9 to 5 all the time. And somehow that morphed into 8 to 5:30 and then 7:30. And now we've got meetings at the Sleep Society starting at 7, but it was unheard of. When I was growing up, my mother said, there's private time before 9 a.m. and after 9 p.m. And you can wake up and do what you want, but that's not when you go to work or school unless you're in a certain type of job where you're needed. But, generally, you don't call people on the phone in those hours and do things. TV shut off, stores closed. Doesn't happen anymore. We just think we can do things at any old time. And ironically, the sleep research showing us that we couldn't do things whenever we wanted was happening while we expanded our hours to everything.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that disconnect because
Yeah.
one thing that I was thinking about reading the book was how we know this from a whole range of areas in American society that evidence alone is not enough to necessarily shift policy. Right? But what you described there though has me kind of wondering how much of it is that idea that evidence doesn't move people as much as it should, and how much of it was just there just wasn't a connection between the two parties, the scientists, the researchers, and educators. How much of it was the disconnect, and how much of it was people just aren't moved by
Mm-hmm.
compelling evidence?
I think they both play a role, and this is really up my alley because I spent my career as a science writer, and I went into that field thinking, oh, I just need to explain to people in language they can understand what the evidence shows, and then they will change their behavior and they will change their policy accordingly. Well, of course, that was extremely naive. And your choice of the term inconvenient truth is very apropos because, of course, this is a topic that is applicable to many other areas outside of adolescent sleep where we have evidence and we have policy, and they don't hear each other for reasons that don't have a lot to do with the evidence, right? So they both play a role. There is absolutely a trickle down time where it takes a long time for findings of research to reach the policymakers, for sure. And there are reasons that they don't want to hear it also. And that is what we have to contend with. I always like to explain this as we need the evidence. It's absolutely essential, but it's not enough. Nobody changes their policy on the basis of evidence. But if you don't have the evidence, you're going to have a lot more trouble changing the policy, if that makes sense. So even when we had the evidence, it wasn't known. But even when it was known, it wasn't going to be heard until some other things fell into place.
Yeah.
I don't. Sorry, I was just gonna add, and we're not. I mean, I think increasingly, and there are doctoral programs like this, but we're not trained as researchers to think about the kind of public health or not even public health. It can be across the board in all kinds of scholarship. The communication piece to outside audiences beyond our sort of ivory tower, so to speak. I mean, I've always been fascinated by it and interested, but I can't say I was ever, actually trained or taught until I did kind of media training after my first book or something like that. So it's not kind of part of what we do as graduate students at all.
Sure. And how did you two come to this? What was your path to this research, this topic, and ultimately the book?
As you know, as I talk about in the book, it was really just fortuitous. I'm not in the sense of my interest in sleep. I'm not somebody who had poor sleep and then got interested in sleep. It was all about the mentors and people that I met along the way, mostly women, quite frankly. My mentors in graduate school, I worked with someone the late Patricia Lax, who was one of the first insomnia researchers, period, in the country. Then my early research was picked up by Mary Carskadden and some of her colleagues at Brown, and I was invited to come meet them. I was just about to start at Holy Cross, as I talk about in the book, and we met, and kind of one thing led to the next. And it just so happened, though, I think what's most important in this part of the story, and we talk about it in the book, is that I spent this first, what we call tenure track junior research leave in 1994 and 1995, doing research with Mary Carskadden, who wrote the foreword to the book. And it was literally that year that she went, that she gave this talk in Minneapolis, St. Paul, about her work. And kind of, as I say, sort of the rest is history. I don't know how much you want me to go into it in the podcast, but in many ways, it was a relationship that formed, which I think is so much a part of doing good research, particularly in the behavioral sciences and psychology. It's collaborative, it's rolling up your sleeves, it's talking to each other, and then asking and answering the questions. Terra and I met, Terra can give the specifics of the story, but we met before I ever moved to Baltimore because of her founding of Start School Later. But what's great is that, I moved to Baltimore in 2014. And so we live very close to each other and started to talk much more about this intersection between public policy, the science, how do we get the word out? I was invited, I served a previous term on the board of Start School Later, and we just started forming this relationship. And I kept saying to Terra, I think the two of us are right to do a book on this topic. We need to tell the story from our two vantage points, and also how policy and science come together or don't come together, and so on. And this is such a great case study as well. And Terra kept saying, "It's the time's not right yet. The time's not right yet." And I'll let you say a little bit more, Terra.
Yeah, I have a lot of ways to answer the original question in that one. I have a much less straightforward path to this than Amy does, because she spent her career as a researcher in this area, and it was logical to go out and advocate for what she found was really true. Although there's some pushback against doing that in the science community sometimes. You're not supposed to be
In the early days, right. Yeah. It was terrible.
But for me, believe me, Dan, I did not intend to be doing what I'm doing now. This is definitely a really, I could say serendipitous, or I could use another word, result of a variety of things in my life. I never thought I'd be running a nonprofit or out there spending my life trying to change school start times. The reason that I think, want an Aristotelian level of causation, how far back do you want to go? There were various forces in my life that all came together in this work, but I didn't intend it. I was, as I told you, I have a PhD in the history of science, and it focused on how science reaches the public, the popularization of science. So that's always fascinated me. Then I spent my career bringing science to the public. I'm a co-author of the Harvard Guide to Women's Health and Alternative Medicine for Dummies, and a bunch of other books bringing science to the public, but not particularly sleep. Sleep is one thing, but it wasn't a particular interest or passion, just bringing medicine and science to the public. So I did that, but what really pushed me over the edge into this was raising 3 children who started high school at 7:17 in the morning. And when I moved to the area where I live and joined the Citizens Advisory Committee, which is, not the PTA, but a policy advisory group in my county in Maryland, this was the number one issue that they were pushing for back in 2000 and 2001, when I first moved here and my oldest child was going into 7th grade. And I had written on sleep. I wrote an article for Consumer Reports on sleep back in the 80s. And so I knew that sleep mattered, but I wasn't thinking about this so much in terms of sleep as in terms of, obviously, this is a terrible thing to do to a family and children. Have you ever lived with an adolescent? Who in their right mind would want to drag a teenager out of bed at 5:30 or 6 in the morning to go to school? I had seen kids waiting in the dark for buses. It baffled me because that was not my childhood. Obviously, 7:17 was some arbitrary, bizarre time that had become upon for reasons I could not understand. And the community wanted to change it, and they were even going to do something about it that long ago, and yet it never happened. So I got involved. I was involved in other education advocacy movements, and I learned how to be an advocate. And when my youngest was about to graduate from high school, I started a petition, and one thing led to another, and we ended up with this national organization. And I found it incredibly compelling, intellectually interesting, as well as meaningful personally, because I feel like this is a difficult, complex topic with all kinds of repercussions beyond what you might imagine, but we actually can do something about it if we put our heart and soul into it. And those are the kind of causes that I gravitate to. And it's been really fulfilling, but definitely has taken over my life in a way I never would have planned.
It's such a great story. And I do want to talk about Start School Later. But on the barriers, the book, you make the point that the barriers to adolescent sleep aren't sort of like immutable, unchangeable. It's their constructions, right? Society's designed them this way. So Amy, could you maybe start talking us through what are some of the primary barriers that as a society, as an education system, we have put up in front of adolescent sleep?
I think that number one, people respond immediately to their concerns about transportation. In other words, this assumption that you cannot change bus routes. And I should point out, although we don't talk at length about this in the book, that we're learning more and more that actually increasingly few teenagers use school buses to even get to school. So school districts run buses with empty buses. That sort of so that's transportation comes up over and over again. I think the other issue that comes up over and over again is the age of the child. So what you end up happening is parents of younger children who haven't had adolescence yet will be preoccupied about, well, what's the right time for their younger child, or they're sort of accustomed to a particular school time that works for them as a family without thinking about what's going to happen down the line when they have an older child. That comes up over and over again. Teachers, and again, I think part of it's largely politics, but often teachers initially, unless they've had their own personal experience or an experience with sleepy kids in the classroom, they have not quite experienced that for whatever reason or haven't focused on that. Often think about their own personal schedules. So they may be parents themselves and they want to be home earlier. Or we know that there have been various historic periods that teachers have been concerned about for good reason, salaries, and have taken second jobs. And so they've wanted school to get out so they can go to their second job and so on. Or concerned that not actual truth, but that it will cost too much money that it'll cost so much money to change school start times that money could have been money that would go to their salaries. So there's that issue that comes up around teachers. There are just numerous things that come up that are all obstacles that can be dealt with if we focus in on that. The bottom line is this foundational need for sufficient sleep or optimal sleep, and school starting at a time that aligns adolescents' sleep-wake schedule and school start times.
Yeah, I can remember, I think the bus picked me up at 6 a.m. when I was growing up. I lived in a rural area, so it was like there's this whole convoluted bus route, this bus to this place, change buses. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous, but
yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and we know that some of that, I think there was a period of time correct me if I'm wrong, Terra, in the 80s where into the 90s where, school districts were growing and expanding in different parts of the country, and people were sort of suburbs sort of got further and further out. So
it traces back to the mid 20th century, but there was endless consolidation. And of course, we built highways. This is where history is so important, right? All these social and economic factors played into the decision to do this to schools. And they had nothing to do with education or kids. They were just societal factors about what we thought we could do. Yeah. So we were definitely shipping kids off forever. And I spent a lot of time in Vermont where I still see a lot of kids going off to rural schools very, very early on, long, long routes. And they're, as you know, Amy, they're trying to consolidate the districts even more so there. And it's a problem. But it really, as we talk about in the book, it really comes down to a way of thinking about what priorities are and about assumptions about what is most important. And somehow this issue has not made it as the unquestionable, non-negotiable thing that whatever we do, we don't take away a student's opportunity to sleep. That is not on the radar right now. We would never consider solving all these logistical problems by, depriving kids of healthy food, like serving them poison food or not removing the asbestos because it's inconvenient or costly. We assume it's a higher priority not to do that. And this is not a priority. So, everything Amy's saying comes down to the issue we talk about a lot in the book, which is the political will to change. And that rests on various assumptions we make about we can't change, there is no other way to do it, and sleep really isn't that important anyway. So we have to talk about these other factors. But Amy said I would talk a little bit more about, the pushback, which is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. And I think one of the things people don't know as much, and it was certainly eye-opening to me, to realize that when the science first started coming in, and it really was very compelling science, even in the 1990s, it was the school districts that jumped on it. They wanted to make the change. There were many, many districts all over the country that internally started looking, and most of it began in Minnesota, but then it spread other places. But Mary Carskadden's work in the 90s led superintendents and school boards all over the country to study ways to move their high schools back to the times they had started, say, 25 years earlier, before they pushed them all. And they based it on science, just like we were talking about. The problem was that what they soon discovered was that when many of them made these changes, the lives of school administrators and decision makers, the school board members, became absolute hell, because the community came at them with pitchforks about how this change in a school schedule would disrupt lives. And, as we discuss in the book, I'm very sympathetic to that. I totally understand it, because whether you have a kid in school or you teach in a school or you know a kid, public school schedules really do impact virtually every aspect of community life. They touch on everything, and many people are involved in them. And community life is complicated, and childcare is complicated, and a work-life balance is complicated. And people are already on edge because we don't have a system that really supports these things. And people are just hanging on by a thread, like, I managed to get my kid to school and pick them up and get them to this and that. And suddenly you suggest changing it. Well, they panic. And if your job as a school board member or a superintendent is to keep your job, why would you alienate these people? So the school people kind of backed out. And there were sporadic uprisings by parents and sleep researchers over the years trying to get them to change. But they knew pretty well that if they wanted to have a peaceful life and keep their jobs, that they would try to avoid messing with school schedules. I have heard more and more former superintendents tell me this, and tell me in private that they just wish they'd mandate the change from on high, because then they wouldn't have to take the fallout. But they know it's best.
One thing we see here, certainly in Los Angeles, and I'm sure this is true all over, but students are so overscheduled after school that now you have this compounding factor that they're up later and later and later, and they're still getting up early in the morning to get to school. And so that limited sleep time is being crunched even further as they're, getting home from the activities 9, 10 at night.
That's absolutely true, which is a really good point. And that is, even if we move school start times later, it's not the be all and end all solution. There are other reasons that kids are having their sleep cut into, and nobody is denying that at all. The point simply being that if you keep school start times this early, they are not going to get healthy sleep regardless. It doesn't matter how many activities you cut out. It doesn't matter how many screens you take away. They cannot get healthy sleep if you're forcing them to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning every single day. The vast majority of adolescents. Yeah. Those other things are problems. I mean, Race to Nowhere, which obviously talked about all these issues, was a big proponent of later school start times, amongst other things. And they're absolutely right. And we've spoken at a lot of their community events, But we think this is just a fundamental structural change that has to happen. And it's the only one, by the way, where there is actual evidence that it not only can be done, but when it is done, it actually does make a difference on a population.
Imagine that.
All the other stuff is theoretical. Yeah.
And then the myth, I think you were interested in myths, and that they don't stay up later. They gain the sleep largely from the time getting up later in the morning, because that's an assumption people have too. Oh, you'll make it later, and then adolescents will just stay up even later at night.
They stay up extremely late regardless of what you do. They just do. I've lived with a lot of them.
They do. I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old myself, and I know that they're capable.
And it becomes increasingly a struggle. But the pressure to excel at school definitely is compounded. And as they get into their junior and senior year in high school, in particular, especially the high flyers that are talked about in Race to Nowhere, the ones who decide they're going to play that game, it's brutal, and they have to choose between succeeding in school and their health, and that isn't right.
I really appreciate the holistic view that you take in the book and in this conversation, that it is bigger than the individual parts. And sometimes in schools, we just constantly, major in the minors, and we're fixated on the tree and never see the forest. But then we had this international experiment we all went through called COVID. And in the book, you write about some lessons we learned about adolescent sleep through the pandemic. Terra, do you want to kind of start and talk through what did COVID tell us?
Well, for me, the biggest lesson from COVID was how amazingly quickly and easily we could make a major systemic change overnight. when we wanted to or had to. All the things we were told just couldn't be done were just done, right? We stopped having in-person class. We went to virtual schooling. Not saying all of this is good, and Amy will talk about that, but we can do things when we want to do things. So things we thought were impossible suddenly become possible. And that was the biggest lesson for me from COVID. Amy has some actual data about other things, but for me, that's a really important lesson about the we can't do it, which is the biggest, obstacle we face. It's just, this would be nice to do, but it's too hard. It's too expensive. It's too complicated. No, if something's important, we can do it.
Well, including, it's a good segue, including so many schools related to the policy issue had virtual school start later. How interesting.
Very few of them, if any, started at 7 a.m. Nobody was getting up at 6. Nobody would even think that they would start at that.
Get on their computers to make sure their 10th graders on the computer doing Zoom school. So, I was part of a research team, but there are now quite a number of studies. I just reviewed another study from Brazil on the topic. So one of the first lessons that was learned from research is that when not surprising, this is kind of a duh, of course, because it confirmed other research, that when you have virtual school start at a reasonable hour after 8:30 in the morning, and often it was later than that, consistently, meaning for the kids who had virtual school every day of the week, those kids had more regular sleep-wake schedules and got more sleep. And they liked that from a sleep perspective. However, for kids who, once we moved to choices in districts doing hybrid or simultaneously doing, other districts at the same time having some kind of quasi-hybrid or changing the schedule during the week, that irregularity was highly problematic. So those kids did not benefit. They had irregular sleep-wake schedules, and in some studies got less sleep than previously. So it's not surprising from what we understand about sleep. Regularity, consistent sleep-wake schedules within 60 to 90 minutes, as well as getting the optimal amount of sleep, are both important. It's not one or the other. What we also learned, and I think is really important to keep in mind, related to all of this, though, is we would not be recommending delayed virtual school for the rest of our lives throughout the United States or anywhere, because virtual school, whether it was consistent or hybrid, had secondary negative consequences for mental health and for kind of school performance. So that's not the solution. The solution is we need later school start times, but kids being in school at the same time.
Did any schools, any districts use that to shift the window a bit, to say, well, you said the lack of political will, and here it forced people to change. Did any school districts stick with it?
Yeah, many of them did, in fact. Many of them, and we list some of them in the book, the superintendent said, this is my opportunity. Everybody's so discombobulated anyway that when we come back, we're going to start at the time we've been working on for the past 15 years, trying to convince the community to do. So yes, I'm not saying it happened as much as it should have, but there were definitely quite a number of districts that did shift later. Or they came up with very creative approaches, like I know one school in Pennsylvania, for example, they decided they'd have like an option to do virtual schooling first thing in the morning for the first hour. And then so the students could come in later if they wanted to. I don't know how that worked with the busing, but it's really worked well for them. It depends on the demographics of the town. So the students could be in a virtual class or they could make up the work later. They just realized that there was a lot more flexibility in the way you could run schools than they had ever imagined. And I think we really get into a mindset when we've been in one town or one district that whatever we do is the best way and the only way to do things. And kids are sometimes the absolute worst examples of that kind of thinking because they've never known anything different. They don't have any basis of comparison. So COVID basically showed we can do things differently. And yes, that opportunity was seized upon, for sure.
So short of an international health emergency, what are ways that we can create political will? And you outline some in the book, but maybe we could talk through your organization, Start School Later, the work you've done. And I love the local government approach, the local aspect. Often in this country, we get so wrapped up in national politics and but so much of our lives are dictated at the local political level. How can we create political will?
As we say in the book, that's the $1,000,000 question. I wish I knew, but I have observed, and again, history, very useful here. Look at other social reform movements. Always has been multi-pronged, multifaceted efforts by a variety of people. It has not been simply the scientists coming down and say, make a change, go to the national level. I think women's suffrage is a really good example of a place where there was local, regional, state, and national. We didn't really know how it would ultimately be resolved, but basically you've got to get people from a variety of sectors to understand that it's in their interest to do this. And the way that you do that is through a variety of approaches. We don't know all the answers, but what I've observed and what I've learned from history is that you can't just say, we're going to go have a constitutional amendment on start times and that'll take care of it. That is not the answer. You have to work person by person from the bottom up, but you also have to work from the top down. So we work on policy statements from major organizations, but we also talk at local elementary schools, right? Out there with volunteers, talking about sleep, talking about the benefits of later start times, trying to make people understand there are other ways to do things. We have to meet, and we have to do this more. We have to meet with all the stakeholder groups to get them to understand that this is in their interest. And it's not always about sleep for all of them, right? For teachers, it might be about, they might care about sleep if they understand it, but they also need to understand that this is good for their family lives, for their ability to teach students, for attendance, for graduation rates and things that they or the other school personnel might care about. You have to make people understand in the community that having sleep-deprived teenagers driving around all day might not be good for road safety. And so you have to work with all these different organizations. And so it really is, I just always use the term multi-pronged, multifaceted. We've got to, and this is what we do at Start School Later. We have local chapters, we have state chapters. We go into DC and meet with legislators. We talk with national agencies. We run workshops, we talk at local schools, and this has all been paying off, but very slowly. And it really just comes down to, are the people making the decisions going to benefit from this? How do we make it in their interest to make a change? And just keep that at the forefront of our mind instead of, we're right, this is the science, you should do it. And I think that's very, very hard for people. Amy's a true academic, but I'm trained as an academic, come from that background. We're all trained to think, we're right, you should just do it. But that does not work. It's about making it in people's interest to make the right change.
And Amy, are the arguments by Start School Later and in your research, how is it received when you meet with people at those local levels, whether it's parents or a school board, a superintendent? What kind of reaction do you get? What kind of conversations are you having?
I do think that in general, the sleep field, the word has gotten out in a way that's different than 10 to 15 years ago. So I do think that people hear the science and the foundational, we started the conversation about the foundational importance of sleep differently now than they did decades ago. I do think we've made progress in that regard because of podcasts like yourself and media coverage, extensive media coverage, social media, increasingly sleep being not nearly enough, but being part of a high school biology class and so on. So I do think that's slowly changing, not changing enough. Museum exhibits. Terra and I both just learned about a colleague of ours in Texas at Baylor who, has been doing incredible science museum exhibits and getting people into the public. So I think that has changed a bit, I have to say. I do think, not because of anything I've done, but because of Start School Later, influencing researchers are focusing on health. Health seems to be a key area that gets people concerned, mental health and physical health, more so than school behaviors or school performance. So learning how to tell the story and what people are going to respond positively to it. But at the end of the day, there's still major struggles. There's still major struggles. Superintendents and principals that don't even want to have the conversation, partially, as Terra was talking about earlier, because of their political concern about whether they really want to jump into this. But again, I would say even though it's slow, and hence the title of the book, Educating the exhausted adolescents and the exhausted researchers, activists, historians, community members, parents, we're in a very different place than we were only 10 years ago. That's for sure.
And so for a principal or a superintendent listening right now who maybe has some of the political will, but is not sure where to start, other than, of course, making your book the next book in their book club. That's step
100%.
Right. But Terra, what's a good starting point for school leadership that wants to seriously take this on, but maybe, as you've noted, it's not just a simple fix. It's not one thing or two things. It's a lot of things. So where do we start?
There are lots of things that can help these school leaders. One of the things we find that is most helpful is that they love to hear from other school leaders who've done this. So we've started running workshops where we have some of the superintendents and principals who've done this talk to their colleagues about what were the real issues, how did we resolve them, how did we deal with the pushback from the community? Because actually one of the things we've learned is that when there is leadership from within the school system, there's a lot less pushback. Because I'm sure you've experienced as a teacher, the school systems have to make large systemic changes fairly often, and there are ways to do it right and there are ways to do it wrong. But one wrong way to do it is to be lukewarm about it and say, we have to do this. They're forcing us to do this. It's going to mess up our lives. Instead of saying, this is going to help the kids, this is going to help the community, here's the research. And when superintendents and principals hear from other leaders, they always say this to us. They'll say, this is what we did. So they need to talk to other leaders, or, definitely come to us because we can connect them to those people, or come to one of our workshops or seminars. Also, there's some really interesting legislation that's going on, like in Maine. And, the California bill is our most prominent success story, where there was a guardrail set for how early schools can begin. And that's a whole other conversation. But Maine recently passed legislation where the Department of Education was given some money to give grants to school systems that wanted to do this. And they've actually given out the first grant to Augusta, Maine. Again, it's not going to go to a district that doesn't have the political will, at least among the leadership. But that money can help them build the will in the community, because there are ways to build community will. We know some of those things. The school community's will can be built by following other principles we've found, like authentically engaging with the stakeholders about what their concerns are, creative problem solving about some of the logistical challenges that are going to come with any change, right? Like, what are we going to do about daycare? What are we going to do about the kids whose parents have to go to work early? These are solvable problems, but you do have to facilitate that so they can learn from that. The community engagement, the raising awareness and reminding the community about why you're doing this. Why are we inconveniencing you? And by the way, we're harming our kids by not changing. Let me show you. So they can avail themselves of these resources with this kind of legislation. So I would like to see the organizations that support the school staff to support this kind of legislation, because they do need this help. There is help, there are resources, but they're not hearing about it. They're not availing themselves of it, about how to get this done. Like, we do know. And, San Francisco, when they had to change start times because of the California law, they reached out to several researchers who had learned from this, and as well as their own mistakes. And by engaging the whole community and using algorithms, they came up with a way to comply with the California law, but also turned out they saved $5 million a year annually in transportation costs. And the community was great with it, but they connected with people around the country who had done this. So there's a way. There are resources. We know how to do it, but you have to want to do it. And hopefully more school leaders.
Right, and the other interesting example from years ago is Seattle, where they spent several years educating the entire community, because in essence, we care about sleep for everybody, sleep health, I do some other work regarding sleep in the juvenile justice system in Maryland and in DC. And one of the big concerns we have is not just for those youth who are in these systems, but for the staff who are taking care of them. And that's true for teachers as well. So teachers sleep is valued as well. And so I think that communities that have paid attention to that, there's greater impact when you think of the whole community.
Right. The book is Educating the Exhausted, Adolescent Sleep and the Struggle for a Later School Start. Amy and Terra, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Great book. There's so many education books out there, and so many of them overlap and end up sort of being a bit redundant. Here's one that's not many books out there about the importance of sleep and what that means to our kids and our students. And thank you so much.
It was our pleasure. Absolutely.